This week we are going to cover registration, authorization, and authentication. The chapter in the book covers the registration, authorization, and authentication concepts, and they cover a fairly complicated project where they actually create their own registration system rather than using the one that comes packaged with MVC. So if you download the app, you can kind of follow along. They do a pretty good job of explaining everything that they are doing in this app. And there is information on where you can or how you can log in as an administrator. And it is in the configure identity file. So if you open that up, it'll be pretty apparent what the username and password are. And so you should be able to follow along with what that project is doing. What we're going to do is a little simpler because we are going to use the registration system that is built into MVC. So this is going to walk you through how to do that. So it's a little less complicated than what the book is doing. So some basic concepts that you should understand. It's first of all, authentication is basically a way of verifying that a user is who they say they are. Totally different than authorization because authorization deals with what a user can do, what they have permission to do, rather than, who they are. So authentication is built into MVC. So when we create an app, if we choose individual user account authentication, the user can either log in with social media or they can create their own registration information. And if they create their own, that does involve a database. When they create their own, SQL Server is used to store that information. That all happens kind of behind the scenes. And basically, it's done automatically when you select individual user accounts. So Entity Framework is automatically added to your project when you choose individual user accounts because it's going to perform the migrations for that registration database system. So we're going to start by discussing authentication, and then we'll get into authorization after that. So authentication basically is going to require that users authenticate or, prove that they are who they say they are anytime they try to access restricted pages in your app. And then there are 3 different ways to authenticate users. You can do Windows authentication, which is normally used in an intranet. So you basically are using your Windows login to authenticate. So if you log into Windows, then that is good enough to prove that you are who you say you are. There's also individual user account authentications, which is what we are going to do. This uses a built-in registration system and encrypted usernames and passwords. So when we create our MVC app, the default authentication type is none. So you have to choose individual accounts. And you'll see that there's a couple other options, but individual accounts is what we are going to use. And that does use ASP.NET Core's identity system. The ASP.NET Core Identity stores the user information, which would be your sign-on information, any roles, claims, in a data store configured by the developer, which is us. And it is part of the Entity Framework Core package. So there's a lot of things that we actually have to do to get all of this working. So when we turn on individual user accounts, there is some code that is going to be added to program CS. And so I've kind of highlighted what you are going to see for your code. It is going to add the application DB context, which is for those individual accounts. And it's also going to add identity user. Okay, and these are just the services that are required for some very basic functionality. By default, all of the MVC apps do include the authorization pipeline. So you will see use authorization, but they do not include authentication. So you will see use authorization, but you're actually going to have to add authentication. Okay, so here is authorization. You are going to have to add authentication. And I think I'm going to highlight that for you too. So hold on. Okay, so these two pieces are really important to have in your middleware pipeline. And so you will have to add the authentication. Now we are going to be using the registration system to authenticate. But a really popular way to authenticate is to use third-party services. And I'm sure you guys have seen this, where you use Google or Facebook or Twitter or something like that, maybe LinkedIn, to authenticate your account. And kind of how that works is it basically sends a request to, whatever social media you've selected. And it just basically says, is this person who they say they are? And then the social media sends something back to the app saying, yep, that person is who they say they are. And that is basically how they're authenticating. And if you authenticate that way, you don't really have to store anything in a internal database. Okay, so that is kind of how that works. In order to set this up in an MVC app, you actually have to install authentication middleware for each authentication service that you want to use. And so you need to use the NuGet package manager. And I've kind of got the different packages listed that you would need to install. And that is not a complete list. So if you click on the link, you can see that the list is fairly extensive of, what you can use to authenticate. To register the third party, you would be doing that in your program CS file, and it would look something like this. Now, the ID and the secret, most of them require some kind of ID and secret. You get those when you go to the developer page and you request an account. Okay, and then you would put your own ID and whatever secret they've assigned you into this configuration. So this whole process is vendor dependent. And each social media application, you have to have an account for, you have to register it. And so you do need the client ID, you need the application secret, and you need some kind of a redirection URL. Okay, so that is basically how it works. There is additional information, more specifics on how to set this up. Okay, and so I've got the link going to Core 7, but you'll see that they now have Core 8 out. So although I think the information they're going to give you is going to be pretty much the same. This hasn't changed that much through the different versions of .NET Core. Okay, so again, super important that you include authentication and authorization in your middleware. The order of these statements is important. So you will put them in between use routing and map controller route, and they need to be in this specific order. If you're going to be using the third-party authentication, a couple things that you should be familiar with are OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. So OAuth stands for Open Authorization. The current version is version 2. It's not compatible with the previous version. Version 2 has been around for quite a while. And this is what lets you select the social media login to authenticate your identity. Okay, so that is called OAuth 2. OpenID Connect is an identity layer that works over the top of OAuth 2. It uses the same underlying REST protocol, but it adds consistency and a little bit of security on top of OAuth. Older versions, and I should say even the current version of MVC, uses OWIN instead of OpenID. Okay, and so we're going to talk a little bit about what OWIN is. And so what is OWIN? It stands for Open Web Interface for .NET, and this is still being used. It basically defines an abstraction between the .NET web server and the web application. So it decouples the web server from the application, and this allows us to create the middleware. Okay, so this is still being used. And for more information on OWIN, I have a link for those of you that are curious. ASP.NET Core Identity is considered an API that supports logins. And it manages users' passwords, profile data, roles, claims, token, email confirmation. There's quite a bit that it manages. And when we set this all up, you will see that it actually creates quite a few tables. We are not going to be using all the tables. How the process works is a user is going to request a page. The server is going to receive the request and see if the user has been authenticated. And what it's going to look for is an authentication cookie in the page request. So if it doesn't find the cookie, it redirects the browser to a login page. And you're going to see how this works because I'm going to have you downloading an app, and we are going to require authentication. So then you'll see how this works. At the login page, once the user enters their username and password, they submit that back to the server. It's going to check the database to make sure that the username and password are in there. And it's going to create an authentication cookie that gets sent back to the browser. If it doesn't find the cookie. If it does find the cookie, which means that the user has logged in, it then is going to check to see if the user is authorized to view the page. So if you just have the authorization attribute, all that requires is that they log in. If we assign roles, then in order for the user to view the page, their role has to be correct. Okay, and you're going to see how all of this works. So if they are authorized, so this is different than authenticated. Authenticated is just logging in. Okay. If they are authorized, then they will have access to the page. Otherwise, it's going to tell them that access has been denied. Okay, and you'll see that. Okay. By default, authorization cookies are session cookies, which means they're good for the current internet session, which kind of makes sense. You could indicate that you want the cookie to persist across sessions. And quite often that's just a remember me checkbox. And so the browser will automatically send the authorization cookie until the cookie expires. This little graphic kind of summarizes that whole process. And basically the benefits of using identity. First of all, it's available in all ASP.NET frameworks. It's pretty easy to customize. If we wanted to do unit testing and we wanted to update, it's fairly easy as well. It does support claim-based authentication, which uses a security token service, which is an industry standard, and it uses OWIN. Which is the middleware that allows us to, well, actually, it's the open web interface for .NET, and it lets us use our middleware pipeline. Once we get to the point where we are going to work with user roles, we can have identity users. We can use identity role, which is actually what we're going to do. So we can have a role for one or more users. And you can kind of see these different classes that we can use. And you will see some in action as we get our role system up and running.